We're going to talk and summarize the findings of the Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States for about the first half, and then we'll have questions and discussion after that. Let me introduce our commission members who are here. It was a commission of 12 Americans, all of whom have served in government, whether in the legislative branch, in the executive branch, elsewhere. And 4 members, including the chair and the vice chair of the commission, are with us tonight. To my left is Madeleine Creedon. Madeleine served as chair of the Congressional Strategic Posture Commission. She's had a long career in federal service. She was the principal deputy administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration within the Department of Energy from 2014 to 2017. Hi, Rose.
Hello.
She served in the Pentagon as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Global Strategic Affairs from 2011 to 2014. She oversaw policy development in the areas of missile defense, nuclear security, combating weapons of mass destruction, cybersecurity, and space. She previously she is an attorney with a JD from St. Louis University School of Law. She served as counsel for the U.S. Senate Committee on Armed Services for many years, and she began there in 1990. So welcome, Madam Chairwoman. To her left is Senator Jon Kyl. He served 18 years in the U.S. Senate, and before that, 8 years in the U.S. House of Representatives from Arizona. He was elected unanimously by his colleagues in 2008 to serve as Republican whip, a position he held until he retired in 2013. He served on the Intelligence, Judiciary, Finance, and Armed Services Committees, among others. He also has served on the board of directors of Sandia Laboratory. He was appointed by Arizona Governor Doug Ducey to fill the seat of the late Senator John McCain through the end of 2018. So welcome, Senator Kyl, who was the vice chair of the commission. The Honorable Rose Gottemoeller, to my right, is currently a lecturer at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and its Center for International Security and Cooperation. Before she came to join us in our area at Stanford, she was Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2016 to 2019. Prior to NATO, she served for 5 years as the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. She was the principal advisor to the Secretary of State on Arms Control, Non-Proliferation, and Political Military Affairs. While she was Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control Verification and Compliance in 2009 and 2010, she was the chief negotiator of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty called New START with the Russian Federation, and that is the last major treaty we've had with Russia restricting nuclear arms. So welcome.
Thank
Rose.
you. Sorry for the late arrival.
It's that traffic up from Stanford, I know it well.
Absolutely.
So let me turn to Chairwoman Creedon to summarize the commission process and our report.
Well, thank you so much, Gloria, if we can be a little less formal, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
And I really appreciate being here this evening with you all and having the opportunity to discuss today's unique geopolitical challenges. But before we actually get into the recommendations of the commission, I wanted to start with a little bit of history and sort of set the stage for our commission and why, and some of the reasons why we did what we did. So in 2008, Congress was coming off some fairly contentious debates on nuclear systems and policy, including 2 proposals for 2 new nuclear weapons, a robust nuclear earth penetrator called the RNEP, and a reliable replacement warhead, and whether these systems would make nuclear use more or less likely. The START Treaty, the the START 1 treaty, was going to expire in December of 2009. And when that happened, there would be nothing in place to constrain the size of the U.S. and the Russian strategic nuclear arsenals. An election was coming in November of 2008, and there would be a new administration the following January. Moreover, the Cold War had been over for more than a decade. The cooperative threat reduction programs with Russia were coming to a close. The Russian economy was expanding, and Russia was many years into a significant effort to modernize its nuclear forces, its warheads, its delivery systems, and its infrastructure. And it was time for a comprehensive review and assessment of U.S. nuclear policy, posture, force structure to guide the new administration. So Congress established the first Strategic Posture Commission in 2008 to conduct this review. The chair and the vice chair of that first commission are probably well known to everyone here. They were two former secretaries of defense, William Perry and Jim Schlesinger. And they issued their report in 2009 with over 150 recommendations. In retrospect, two significant themes stand out from that report. The first is that the relationship with Russia, which was seen as hopeful with real opportunities for collaboration and joint efforts to reduce the size of the respective nuclear arsenals and to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons generally. That was the environment in which they were doing their work. And of course, you'll recall that in 2007, former Senators Sam Nunn, George Shultz, William Perry, and Henry Kissinger published the first of what would be a series of 5 op-eds in the Wall Street Journal about the path to reducing nuclear weapons. And the second point is that the report itself focused on Russia. There was almost no mention of China in that 2009 report. So the policy considerations on which the first commission were most focused, however, were also very different. In the 2009 report, the policy balance was between the need for effective nuclear deterrence on the one hand and to lead international efforts to prevent nuclear proliferation and reduce the saliency and the number of nuclear weapons globally. That commission also hoped that the world would head in a direction in which proliferation and nuclear terrorism are reduced and where there is cooperation among major powers to ensure strategic stability. They, and I'll quote from Secretary Perry, they rejected the vision of a world defined over the next decade or two by a renewal of competition for nuclear advantage among the major powers. President Obama's 2009 Prague speech and the Obama administration's 2010 nuclear posture review also reflected much of that optimism while reinforcing the need for a safe, secure, effective, reliable, and credible nuclear deterrent. Indeed, by April 2010, the U.S. and Russia had signed the rapidly negotiated New START treaty, thanks to Rose's good work, that placed limits on operationally deployed strategic systems and warheads. While there were still significant problems in the U.S.-Russia relationship, there was a view that additional arms control agreements would follow New START and that the risk of nuclear confrontation would diminish. At the same time, however, the U.S. also started on a delayed and much-needed modernization program for its nuclear weapons delivery systems and infrastructure. Each leg of the triad would be replaced: bombers, ICBMs, and ballistic missile submarines, and the warheads would all go through a significant overhaul, known as the Life Extension Programs. This effort, with the addition of a new long-range standoff cruise missile, is what we now refer to as the Program of Record. As planned, that effort was sized and still is to meet the limitations of the New START treaty. So fast forward 14 years, and it's a very different world. The scenario that the first commission hoped to see not only didn't come to fruition, but the world has actually gone in the opposite directions, as tensions have increased and the probability of nuclear use, while still low, has increased. Russia, in particular, has sought to cajole and coerce Ukraine and others with the prospect of nuclear use, going so far as to deploy nuclear weapons into Belarus. As a result, in 2021, as part of the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act, Congress once again sought a review and assessment of U.S. nuclear policy, strategy, posture, and force structure, and established a new Strategic Posture Commission, our commission. So our 2023 report, which we just issued in October, is consistent with our statutory charge. which was to conduct a review of the strategic posture of the United States, including a strategic threat assessment and a detailed review of nuclear weapons policy, strategy, and force structure, and factors affecting the strategic stability of new peer competitors of the U.S. and peer and near-peer nuclear power competition. And this language conveys one of the many meaningful changes from the first Commission report, and that really is the emergence of China. In the statutory language, the near-peer nuclear power is China, although if it stays on its current trajectory, it will be a peer nuclear power in a decade or so, as it rapidly expands its nuclear and non-nuclear force structures. Thus, for the first time, the U.S. will need to deter two nuclear peers, a significant change in the geopolitical landscape from 2009. So as Gloria mentioned, our commissioners, there were 12 of us. We came from a broad range of the political spectrum, but we were all committed to completing our task and producing a clear-eyed consensus report. Our report is threat-informed, it's forward-looking, and it's bipartisan. The report provides high-level guidance to shape future decision-making and generally refrains from picking specific systems. We provide characteristics of recommended capabilities, but we did not pick specifically winners and losers. We do support the program of record, but find that while necessary, it is not sufficient. The time frame for our report is important. It's 2027 and beyond, looking at least to 2035. Although the report is hard-hitting, it is actually fairly subtle, and this subtlety has led to some confusion about what the report does and does not recommend. To be clear, we are not recommending substantial increases in the U.S. nuclear force posture. We do not endorse a new nuclear arms race. We do, however, support additional conventional forces, such as air refueling tankers, conventional prompt strike, missile defense, cyber, and space capabilities. We also support continued diplomatic efforts to reduce risk and increase strategic stability. We are not, by any stretch, abandoning arms control and related efforts, such as transparency and confidence-building measures. Sadly, that hopeful environment and the vision of widespread reductions from 15 years ago is no longer realistic, and the prospects for agreements on nuclear arms control today appear bleak. China has little to no interest in traditional arms control, although the recent discussions between Xi and Biden, which were here, seem to have made some small progress towards transparency. There's no reason to stop pursuing these broader risk reduction efforts when achievable and in the U.S. national interest. And we believe if there are opportunities, they should be explored. But let's turn now to the threat, which is really the basis for most of our recommendations. We devote a chapter of the report to the growing threat from China and Russia, plus North Korea and Iran, although the pacing and guiding threats are, of course, Russia and China. It's important to understand what each country is doing to upend the global order. We all know that threats from Russia and China are different, but each is growing and expanding. China is developing a true nuclear triad more rapidly than expected. It's increasing its nuclear stockpile, and it appears to be moving away from a no-first-use posture. Both China and Russia are engaged in coercive and aggressive behaviors regionally and are a significant threat to our allies and partners. Both are trying to divide U.S. alliances, challenge and limit the U.S. role in the world, and expand and substitute their influence and leverage. Today, the U.S. is on the cusp of a fundamentally different global setting for which we did not plan and are not well prepared. So as a result, the Commission was very focused on getting and being prepared and laying the foundation now for the decisions in the future, because we want to ensure that decision makers in the future can actually make decisions and that they have options to do so. So I'll close with just the 5 assumptions that underpin our report. Russia and China will continue their current respective adversarial paths, each growing the quality and quantity of their nuclear arsenals. China will continue to grow its conventional forces, including its space and cyber capabilities. Russia will also grow its space and cyber capabilities and increase its nuclear capacity. And each will continue their aggressive foreign policies and seek to supplant the U.S. global leadership role. Number 2, today's one major war strategy is no longer viable, particularly given China's current trajectory. The 6 foundational long-standing tenets of U.S. nuclear strategy remain valid. 4, strong allies and partners are essential and make all of us stronger together, but we need greater cooperation, coordination, and integration. And finally, the U.S. deterrent must be credible and seen that way by our adversaries as well as our partners. And finally, we spent a fair amount of time talking about the fact that the U.S. needs a true whole-of-government approach to deter and prepare for the possibility of a two-theater conflict. Nuclear and conventional force sizing and composition must reflect this strategy. It could be larger, it could be different, or it could be both. In any event, thank you so much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here with our colleagues. I'm sorry the rest of us are not here this evening, but having set the stage for a little bit more detailed discussion, I'll close and hand it off to the Vice Chair.
Thank you very much. I think the history lesson that Madeline has given here is really important because it will inform how we go forward and try to avoid mistakes that we've made in the past. I'm going to be a little bit more specific now. You heard Madeline say that the program of record, that's the technical term that we use for the things that we want to achieve in the near term here, is absolutely essential. And that program of record is really two big things simultaneously. We're refurbishing our nuclear weapons. We're bringing them up to date. We're not adding any. We're not creating any new capability, but well, I'll give you an example. One of the lab directors gave me a vacuum tube as a souvenir. He said, we took this off of the front of one of our warheads and we replaced it with a circuit board. So there are some modernization things like that occurring with our very sophisticated nuclear weapons. The other thing that's being done is at the same time replacing all of the delivery vehicles for these weapons. The bomber force, the Minuteman missiles, and the submarines with their ballistic missiles. Unfortunately, both of these things have to happen at the same time. So we've got two big bills coming due at the same time. That's our current program of record. And what was this all designed to do? It was designed to get us back in the game with Russia. Something new happened. China came along and decided that it wanted to be the equal of Russia and the United States, and embarked on what many have called the greatest, a breakout of greatest military significance since the Cold War. And one thing we learned was that the Chinese habitually get their programs done ahead of schedule rather than behind schedule, which frequently characterizes our problems. So in about 10 years or so, they believe that they will have a nuclear triad, the equal of Russia's and the United States. We have not planned for that. That's not baked into any of our current military planning, equipment, capabilities, or whatever. We've begun to think about it, and that's where our commission comes in. So we said, yes, we have to complete the existing program of record, 2010 version, but that's not sufficient to deal with the new threat. For that, we have to do some new things. Basically, we're going to have to create a new second program of record, which hasn't been done yet. And we recommend basically 3 time frames to accomplish several things here, an immediate, a medium term, and a longer term. We don't know exactly how many nuclear weapons we're going to need to deal with both Russia and China. We don't know exactly what else we're going to need. But we do want to be sure that we have the capacity to produce what we need when we figure it out. And so in the near term, we're recommending that the United States must accelerate its modernization of the entire nuclear enterprise. By that we mean our laboratories, our production facilities, our very capable nuclear physicists, all of the experimental things that we work with, and importantly, to develop some production capacity that we don't have. The United States is the only nuclear power in the world today that doesn't have a hot production line. We don't produce nuclear weapons now. You didn't know that. We have to create that capability. And so we're gradually beginning to think about how to do that. But there have been a lot of starts and stops here. A lot of things went wrong. There are a lot of people to blame. But the reality is we're stumbling into this next phase. We recommend we've got to have the production capacity to size a force and with the kind of weapons that we need that will be adequate to deter both Russia and China in the future. Just one example, one of the components of a nuclear weapon is the so-called primary. It's the thing that goes bang first. It's made of plutonium usually. And we need to make plutonium pits for refurbishing these weapons. We haven't made those in a long time except in the laboratory one by one. We now have a plan to produce those at a plant in Savannah River, Georgia. So how do we size that plant? Well, we'd planned on doing about 80 of these a year. We're probably going to have more capacity than that. So that's a kind of decision that Congress and the administration are going to have to make. How big should this be? How much is it going to cost? Let's get on with the job of creating the capacity. So at least we're not denying ourselves the ability to do things when we figure out what we need to do. Then in the medium term, we also need to take a look at what we already have and what we've kind of put on the shelf but might want to bring back into use. After the New START treaty, we took we took some amount of our capability off of the submarines and off of the bombers and fixed them so that they no longer had the ability to deliver a certain number of weapons. One of our recommendations is let's go back, let's practice uploading the weapons that we used to carry on those delivery vehicles so that if we do need to have more capability quickly, we will have at least practiced figuring out how to do it and how to do it quickly. That's just one example of the kind of thing that we want to recommend, at least in the medium term. That's not going to cost a huge amount of money. The beginning work on our production capacity will cost money. And we also recommend in the near term that we rebuild our conventional forces to the extent we can, and that will cost money. Because remember that if we can deter a conventional war, we're probably going to be able to deter a nuclear war. But if a conventional war gets out of hand, it could go nuclear quickly. So you can't just focus on the nuclear side. We've got to have a strong conventional deterrent. I mentioned the first two phases. In the long term, we're probably going to have to spend more money on more things. We recommend, for example, that we will probably need more B-21 bombers than are currently planned. We're probably going to need more of the new replacement missile called the Sentinel than are currently planned. And we are pretty sure we're going to need more of the nuclear ballistic missile submarines, the new Columbia-class submarine, than are currently planned. Those are really long-term projects because we're talking about building out the current program of record, remember, to deal with the Russian problem, and then adding to that whatever we think might be necessary for China. But we're talking now 10 or 15 years out in the future, notionally at least. So we're not talking about spending a lot of money really soon, except on our conventional forces. But these are the kinds of specific things that we recommend should be done to deal with the new threat. Just a couple of other comments. We are already struggling to get our current program of record completed on time. We don't have the same industrial capacity to produce military weapons that we've always been able to count on in the past. We now have supply chains that are so brittle that we can't get everything just in time when we need it, and that creates problems for us. We don't have the technical capability, all the way from welders for building submarines to nuclear physicists. We've got huge workforce and infrastructure deficiencies that will require a whole-of-government approach to address, and that's one of several of our recommendations relate to that. And that's to deal with our current program of record. How about the new stuff we're talking about? Well, times whatever you want to make it. So we've got some big challenges on how we're going to get all of this done and get it done in time so that neither Russia nor China ever feel that they are so far ahead of us that they are tempted to try to engage us in a nuclear conflict. That's what we have to avoid, what we have to deter. The final thing I'll say is that our political leaders in the past have let us down. They haven't talked about this with the American people. How many of your neighbors do you think know anything about what we're talking about here? And how do you think they will respond to their local congressman who calls them to a meeting and says, by the way, I know we want to build more highways and we got to fund education and health care and all, but there's something else we got to do. We have to buy some more ballistic missiles. What are you talking about? Will be the response. So one of our recommendations is our political leaders in Congress and in the executive branch, starting with the president, have got to take this case to the American people, to educate the American people about why we have a problem, what the problem is, and how we're going to work our way out of it, and what it's going to require from them in terms of supporting public policies to get this job done. If we don't do that, we fear Congress won't make the kinds of decisions that it has to make in order to effectuate our recommendations. So that's a little bit more of a granular view of the kind of things we're recommending to deal with the threat that Madeleine discussed.
Thank you.
I'll make a few quick points. I know we want to get to our discussion, but first of all, I wanted to emphasize a couple of things that both Madeleine Creedon and John Kyle have said. First, getting to the point about near-term, medium-term, long-term, we just heard about. The report is very much focused on the period. Our tasking was look at the situation from 2026, 27 to 2035. And so we were focused on thinking about that longer term, but we also realized that we had to get there by going through these near-term phases, particularly ensuring that our program of record in existence for over a decade is fully implemented. It's necessary but not sufficient, and we didn't want to see any chance of further delay falling into this near-term period. We've got to get the program of record implemented. The second point I'd like to make has to do with the fact that the language in the report was really carefully calibrated to give the U.S. government as much flexibility as possible. In fact, at least when I've been briefing it around some of our government colleagues, they said, why didn't you prioritize things, But the point was we wanted to not select winners and losers in particular program areas, as Madeleine has already mentioned, but just talk about how we see the threat environment and then what we need to do about it through different phases over the next 15, even 20 years up to the 2040s. So that was very, very important, not to pick winners or losers or endorse particular programs. We also did not insist on a quantitative answer to the problem of having more nuclear targets. Rather, you'll see throughout the report that we stress that changes to the size and or composition of the nuclear forces would be necessary to address the greater number of nuclear targets. So this language conveys that for the United States, the answer is to the problem of more targets is quantitative, perhaps it's qualitative, or perhaps it's a combination of those two things. So I wanted to get that out on the table for our discussion as well. The recommendations and findings of the report are consistent with the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, the speech he made to the Arms Control Association last June, talking about the goals of U.S. policy in this area. And the report is clearly threat-based, as both Madeleine and John have said. It's very hard-edged in talking about the threat, and so it needs to be. But in our findings, we recognize that we have to, because of the nature of that threat, look to a future either with or without further nuclear arms control. But just as Madeleine said, we did not embrace the notion of a future without nuclear arms control, and if at all possible, we want to be able to pursue risk reduction activities, continue to do that. I've been very glad to see that when President Xi Jinping and President Biden met here at Filoli down the road, that they endorsed continuing talks, as have been begun in early November, on arms control and nonproliferation between the United States and China. This is a breakthrough. The Chinese never agreed to talk about arms control in the past as a specific topic. So I hope that based on the president's endorsement, we can continue to move down that path, and we'll see where it takes us. But arms control risk reduction, strategic stability discussions, these things should and will, I think, continue to be under consideration for both the Russians and the Chinese, and we need to see whether the Chinese are going to bite. So far, they've been very reluctant, but maybe we're headed in the right direction. Final point I'd like to make, and it's already been mentioned, but the report does talk a lot about nuclear capabilities and capacity and the problems that we have in that arena, but a full spectrum of non-nuclear capabilities is essential to the nation's strategic posture. This report is called America's Strategic Posture. It's not called America's Nuclear Posture. So we'd also recommend a number of non-nuclear capabilities, resilient space architecture, our ability to ensure that the United States is on the cutting edge of emerging technologies. And this was something I think Gloria might have a few more words to say about, because we were insistent that the United States must stay on that cutting edge going forward. Prioritization of long-range precision strike that is conventional in nature, long-range missiles that are conventional in nature. Madeline has mentioned that. And developing and fielding homeland integrated air and missile defense that can deter and defeat coercive attacks by Russia and China, as well as continue to be able to deter North Korea from striking the continental United States. So these are some of the non-nuclear areas that we were also very focused on, as well as just the bread and butter of what we need to do to keep our aircraft flying. For example, again, Madeline mentioned modernization and upgrading of the tanker fleet. So just a few additional points. I wanted to really foot stomp some of the messages that have already come out from the chair and vice chair. But with that, over to you, our fearless chairman here at the Commonwealth Club.
Thank you very much, Rose. I'm going to take just a moment putting on my hat as a commission member and then returning to my hat as the moderator. Just a word about the commission. 12 members, all have served in government but are not currently serving in government. Evenly divided, so bipartisan, 6 notional Democrats, 6 notional Republicans, appointed by congressional leaders, the Armed Services committees of both houses, and other congressional leaders like majority and minority leaders. I happen to be the appointee of our friend Nancy Pelosi when she was majority leader. A broadly cast group. I have heard, although I've not verified this, but this was the second commission of this type. I have heard that the idea came from Ellen Tauscher, also a member of Congress from our area, and who was a member of the Commonwealth Club board, now unfortunately passed away. And her idea was that the Defense Department does its posture reviews, but that there ought to be periodically an independent one that is not done by sitting government officials in a department, but that is done by those with the appropriate experience, but who are independent. So, independent commission. And I
just add a quick footnote? Yes. And this is interesting from the earlier commission. It only had 1 woman on it out of the 12. We were evenly divided, Republican and Democrat, also evenly divided men and women, which I liked very much.
And we started from very different perspectives, I think, but it is a consensus report. After taking a look at the intelligence and the information and the magnitude of the changes since the prior commission report, we all agreed on our conclusions and recommendations. A very few additional words. In the national security field, we often say that a threat is a combination of intentions and capabilities. So we have seen a major change since the 1990s in the threats we face that are combinations of the intentions and capabilities of other major powers. So Russia has been modernizing its military capabilities and has been engaging in a brutal, unprovoked, and inexcusable war in Ukraine. That is the combination of the capabilities and what we read as intentions towards other countries by Russia. In China, it's been referred to their dramatic buildup. China is on a program to add 1,000 strategic nuclear weapons by about 2035 or so. But as John said, they tend to meet their goals faster than they set them out. We have two authoritarian countries with designs on their neighbors. China has been talking about repatriating Taiwan, even by a certain date. We also have protestations of collaboration between Russia and China, of their undying friendship and so on, and also increasing threats from North Korea and Iran. So these combinations of capabilities and intentions have changed the environment from the U.S. My last service in government was in a thankful, wonderful role I was able to play, helping to get rid of about 7,000 nuclear weapons in the former Soviet Union through what was called the Nunn-Lugar program, together with my colleagues here. That was a unique point in time when the doors were open with Russia in particular, and Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan to get rid of a number of their nuclear weapons that had been targeted against us. It is a very changed environment today. We must, above everything, protect ourselves. We have to have an effective deterrent. And the changes in numbers of nuclear weapons facing us make that a different proposition today than it has been in the future. And hence, sizing our nuclear force or deploying it or targeting it, whatever, in a way that continues to ensure our deterrence, ensures that our values and our allies and our interests in the world are protected in a way that we can continue to maintain a system that is different from the more authoritarian systems that we see as adversaries. I will say that we looked at potential for arms control as part of this survey, and we did make a proposal. We found one technology called fractional orbital bombardment systems that the Chinese have been pursuing to be something we felt perhaps we, Russia, China, could all agree on to have a ban on this type of technology. So we did propose seeking such a ban. We also proposed in our report to have the U.S. intelligence community do more work on figuring out why the Chinese are adding so many strategic nuclear weapons so rapidly. What's the intention there? What's the goal there? Final note, it seems to me, and it seemed to us, that it will be a while until we are able to get any productive, more collaborative discussions going with Russia, having to do with leadership in Russia. With China, perhaps there are possibilities still, as exemplified by the meetings that took place around APEC here, not only between President Xi and Biden, but also between the Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control and Verification, Mallory Stewart, and her counterpart on the Chinese side, where they discussed arms control and nonproliferation. So anyhow, I will end there and invite, do we have any questions that have come in? Thank you very much. Okay. We have lots of questions. Well, let's start with a rather general one. And please, fellow commissioners, feel free to take a stab, anyone who would like to. What are the major political or other roadblocks to proceeding with the proposed plan by the Commission?
Congress.
Part of it is just talking about it. You know, as John mentioned, we haven't talked about this in a very long time, so we just have to talk about it. And one of the other things that this report does, because we don't substitute our judgment for the Defense Department, we just try and present what the problem is. We have provided, if you will, the Defense Department and the State Department and the Energy Department and all of the executive branch a problem that they have to now go do the work to figure out how do we address these. What are the things that they're going to have to develop? How many more ships? What's going to be different about it? And how do they think about now addressing these two peers, these two nuclear peers, which is completely unprecedented. I mean, we've never had anything like this before. And as we said, it's an environment we didn't want, we hadn't planned for it, and now we have to do something about it. So I think that's probably the biggest one. Is just as a country understanding what this threat is and what we're going to have to do about it.
Let me add something to that. I because it's a very good question. You are all aware, because you read the newspaper and follow the news on TV, of the machinations that the Congress is going through right now to do lots of different things, but at the center of it is trying to fund the government for another year. And at the center of that is both the authorization bill for the Defense Department and the various appropriation bills that fund the programs that we're talking about here. Getting Congress to pass those bills and to do so in a sensible way will be very difficult, because this isn't something their constituents care about. And also because they've got some internal partisan issues going back and forth. They've also fallen into some very bad habits of not getting their work done on time, namely getting appropriations bills passed, as a result of which everything piles up at the end of the year, and their only realistic alternative usually is to ball it up into a great big omnibus appropriation bill on a Tuesday night and send it to the respective houses for passage by Thursday. Well, this does not please the rank and file, as you can imagine, and it makes for a very bad legislating. They usually can't quite get all that done quickly, so they just kick the can down the road for a couple months with a continuing resolution, which is, well, we'll just keep spending the money we spent last year on the same things we funded last year until we figure out this new thing. And that goes on for a while. Now, you're a defense contractor, and you're supposed to bid on contracts to give the Defense Department what they want. How do you plan in this environment? You can't. You have to hire real people, and you have to have real space, warehouse space or manufacturing space and so on. It's really hard, the way that the Congress and the Pentagon do business, for our private sector to get in the game and help out here. They want to, but it's hard. So there are a lot of reforms throughout our government that need to occur. And this is another reason we talk about a whole of government approach. Everybody needs to chip into the solution, to provide help for the solution. And let's see, I guess both of you had made the point earlier, and Gloria and Madeline, that this starts with a conversation with the American people.
How does a three-peer scenario differ from two-peer scenario? How does this change how we must strategically position ourselves?
Well, part of it is in any, and I think I'll take it in a little bit different direction. So in your own personal relationships, very often it's much easier to have a one-on-one relationship. Well, in dealing with countries, it's often easier to have a bilateral relationship, have a one-on-one relationship. When you introduce a third party, you've totally changed the dynamic. So agreements, customs between the two, ways to resolve issues over time between the two. Now you have a third party in the mix. So it changes, it really does change the dynamic. It changes how each party thinks about the other two parties. It changes how one party may decide to align with another party in a way that is new. For us, in a deterrence perspective, it changes how we think about what we need. So when we were mostly focused on Russia, we had a better sense of what we needed to deter conventional war. now that China is in the mix, it makes it harder. We have to come to a different conclusion because the theaters are very different, obviously, require different things. The European theater is more land-based. The Asia-Pacific theater is more sea-based. It's more ships. They're just very different. So we have to not replicate things, but we have to think about, well, what does this theater need? What does this theater need? And also, we have to think about what if they collaborate? What if they do something together? Or what if they do something sequentially? What if there's an opportunity for aggression when one occupies us over here and the other then comes in for this opportunistic approach? It's very different. And so I'll just say in the same way that a relationship with two people is very different from a relationship with three people.
And just to add very briefly to that, we also have very different alliance relationships in the two theaters with the NATO alliance, obviously now 31 countries, and been very coherent in my view since the Russian invasion of Ukraine a year ago, February. But that's very different from our very good allies in Asia, ROK, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, far-flung allies in some cases, but also allies that we are dealing with more on a bilateral, parallel basis rather than everybody working together in quite the same way that the NATO alliance works. So it's different. But I do want to underscore the point of the report about the importance of our alliance relationships and how they are a force multiplier for the United States in so many ways, because that was a very fundamental finding and recommendation among those in the report.
Thank you. I get the sense that the U.S. alone will not adequately deter Russia, China, Iran in the future. Does this commission engage the EU and the collective West in working toward broader combining capability and creating broader collective nuclear deterrence?
Well, it's exactly what Rose just talked about.
Deterrence relationship. And we do talk about the necessity of looking at non-strategic nuclear capabilities and thinking anew about how we extend nuclear deterrence to our allies, again, both in Europe and in Asia. In Europe, we have the long-standing extended deterrent mission where we have deployed some warheads in Europe, and the NATO allies cooperate with us on delivery in the horrible case that it would ever have to happen. But we work very closely together there. The situation is much different in Asia, and I think that there will have to be a lot of thought going into how we continue to bolster extended deterrence in Asia. I thought the president and his agreement with the ROK president last May to establish this enhanced cooperation between ROK and U.S. on the extended deterrence relationship there was very powerful, and I think we'll have to see more of that occurring in Asia.
Another question about allies. If South Korea and Japan were given the money, could that increase U.S. naval capabilities faster and cheaper than having all the work done in the USA? Is this inaction a strategic risk, or for congressional members a risk worth taking to keep jobs in the USA?
So I think,
no, Senator Kyle, that's a good one for you.
We'll turn that one over. But I mean, it is important that we expand these relationships with our allies, and that we also have an obligation to look to our allies for more than what they do now, and they have an obligation to us to demand greater cooperation. So we have to expand our cooperation with them. And when I say that, I don't just mean what we often think about and just having our allies buy more American things, but we also have to utilize their capabilities, their industrial base, utilize their technical skills, do joint development work, do joint production work. There are some very good programs right now in the missile defense arena where we're doing joint development and joint production with Japan.
Yep.
We need to do more of that. Space is a great way and a great opportunity where we can do joint work. Not only, we have a lot of things going on with Australia, where we have joint satellite development programs, and also where we have joint situational awareness. The Australians have some pretty good, very good capabilities on the ground to help with greater understanding of what's going on in space, the space situational awareness. So we have to expand all of these capabilities, and some of our allies are doing really well in terms of their contributions, and others, frankly, need to do a little more.
And it's complicated because a sovereign country does what's best for it, and that isn't always what's best for everybody else. So you can't necessarily say, well, the United States can solve some of our deterrent problems by shoving it over onto an ally. A good example here, we're having, well, I'll state it differently. There is some disagreement about what would be best for Taiwan to deter China from ever trying to attack it. Countries sometimes like to buy shiny objects to show off to their folks, but maybe they'd ought to be buying quiet submarines that nobody ever sees, just for example. So it's fine to have allies. I mean, it's more than fine. It's necessary, and that's one of our strengths, because we've got allies, and our adversaries really don't, except their little tight group among themselves. But it's not necessarily a one-for-one force multiplier. You've got to work with them to coordinate what everybody is producing, make sure it works together, make sure they can deploy things together, and that everybody's pulling in the same direction if you're going to rely upon other countries, for example, as NATO partners.
Why weren't we prepared for the rise of China? It seems like a massive oversight from intelligence.
I think the business community in the United States, and to some extent the political community, was so enamored with the prospect of making a lot of money off of a 1 billion plus market of Chinese folks that we were willing to overlook for years a lot of intellectual theft and other practices by China that in ordinary circumstances would not be considered friendly at all, but we overlooked it. Moreover, nobody likes to think about war or preparation for war, and to me it was, I was there at the time. I went through the debates about should we let China into the WTO? Well, they're just going to disrupt things. They'll never comply with the WTO court rulings and so on. Well, no, we need them in there because if they're in the tent, then they'll have to cooperate with the rest of us. And besides that, we can all make a lot of money. There's a lot of hope involved in all of this. And sometimes it's not realistic. Sometimes it pans out.
What are the challenges that the advances in AI will present to our national security?
Well, I think at a very high level, we have to first understand there are two pieces of this, right? So what is it that can be done for national security, and I mean that by a whole of government writ large, and then the flip side of that is what is the threat from it? And so we have to be able to understand both and utilize both. The other thing is right now there's not a great understanding of what it can do. There's some small examples, but we have a long way to go, in really understanding both what is the threat picture and also how do we utilize it. One of the things that I do think may be out there is understanding how to get the most out of big data. So that is one thing where I think the department has been Department of Defense and also the Department of Energy has been working, is to really understand how to manage very large data sets.
I want to give a little shout out here to Gloria, because she on the commission was the one who was really focused on ensuring that we were focusing our efforts on emerging technology as well as on all the other problems that we were wrestling with. So I wanted to throw the question to you, Gloria. Do you have a quick comment you'd like to make on it?
I am not an AI expert, and I know there are those here who could answer that question a lot better than I could. So.
All right. Well, shout out anyway.
Yes.
It was very valuable having you there.
Thank you. How did the 2024 presidential candidates, some who are state governors, become aware of your report? Aides reading and summarizing is not as effective as hearing, as we are tonight, directly from commission members.
Well, I have no idea is probably the answer to that question. I hope they read it. Coming here, getting outside of Washington, is very important to have this discussion. Sarah Kyle said we haven't talked about this in a very long time, where we used to have lots and lots of Sovietologists in the federal government. We have very few of those anymore, and we have even fewer who really understand what China's doing. So we have a big learning curve to be able to understand where we're headed. So it's going to take time. We have to build up these capabilities, and just talking about it helps. So conversations are good.
Let me pose that to our person with a long elected history.
We focused on trying to get the message out, but the reality is we only had so much bandwidth as 12 people, and we worked with a very competent group in Washington. IDA is the name of the organization. They have a small communication shop. They were the ones that printed up our reports and helped us do all of the technical work. But they're not all that adept at getting great PR. Even if they had been, we're just about ready to put the report out, and Hamas engages in its horrible activities. And we've talked to several reporters, for example. Why haven't you reported more on what we did? My editors tell me we have to cover the war with Israel. And so we haven't gotten as much publicity as we'd like. We're searching for ways to continue to get the message out. We do call for our leaders to try to get the message out more than it has been in the past. I think about the best you can say here is we thought if we worked really hard to have a consensus among 12 very divergent people, that might help get people's attention. Hey, here's 12 people in Washington agreed on something. What's that all about? And I hope that'll help at the end of the day. It hasn't necessarily too much yet.
All in due time.
It's interesting. When I was quite young and a grad student at Columbia, I worked as a research assistant for Zbigniew Brzezinski. Mm-hmm. And he signed on with the Carter campaign when Jimmy Carter was governor of Georgia. And I was able to watch and be part of a real effort he made to bring Jimmy Carter up to speed about international issues. And he enlisted many colleagues, Madeleine Albright and others. He had a whole team to brief Jimmy Carter and familiarize himself with issues beyond the borders of the state of Georgia. So it seems like it would be good if national security experts began to work in similar ways with some of the governors who may be running for president and try to uplift their level of knowledge about the international environment.
Gloria, could I add something here? We spent a lot of time trying to answer the question. In fact, there's an entire chapter in the report about stakes. What's at stake here? Why do we care about this? And therefore, why should the American people care about it? And part of that discussion related to our obligation in the world. Why do we have an obligation? Why aren't we isolationist? We talked about this a lot because there has always been a component of one political party, and there is rapidly developing an equally boisterous component of the other political party that says we don't have to worry about what's going on abroad. We don't need to give any help to Ukraine, for example. That's not our fight. Let's solve our own border first and not worry about their border. You've heard all the arguments. We come out very strongly for the proposition that the United States of America has a critical role to play globally, and that if we don't do it, things can fall apart very, very quickly. Yes, that puts more responsibility on us. It may cost our taxpayers more money, but it's kind of like that old ad, pay me now or pay me later. If the country that can do something about this doesn't take the lead, bring allies and others along and spend what it takes to provide deterrence, aggressors will be tempted around the world. And eventually it'll be a lot worse than it is today. So we take a position on that debate that's occurring in Congress today. Are you more isolationist or more interventionist? And we, as 12, say we don't have any alternative, but to continue to play the global role that we have in the past.
And we really emphasize the message that deterrence is cheaper than fighting the war.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Apart from Taiwan and the resources of the South China Sea, what is the threat from China?
Well, go
Go, no.
All right. Well, two things. First of all, a country doesn't go from almost nothing to a pure nuclear adversary overnight for nothing. Why are they doing what they're doing? We did ask the intelligence community to try to get a little more granularity in that, but the obvious answer generally is so that they will have more capability to do what they want to do without interference from the United States. That's why you have a big nuclear component to your defense establishment. They view themselves as the rising power of the future, and we're the past. And Xi himself personally has spoken and written a lot about the fact that it's about time, and this is not characteristic for a Chinese leader, by the way, but he believes it's about time that China step forward and take its proper role in the world, and that proper role is to be the big dominator, starting with domination within its region. And then you add to that the deficiency that all authoritarian governments have. They don't have the check and balance of their people or others around the world who they listen to. Whatever they want, that's what they're going to get. That's the way their government is structured. Their historic burr under the saddle, which is Taiwan, and their absolute determination to bring Taiwan under Chinese Communist Party control one way or the other, and they're very clear about including by force if necessary. I know the question was other than that, but that's kind of like other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how'd you like to play? This is a big deal and could start World War III. So you put all of that together, and it's just something we didn't want to have to worry about it, but we've got no choice now.
Do current treaties limit or prevent the numbers of weapons required to add deterrent capability to deal with China's threat?
There are no treaties with China.
China.
That's one of the problems. There are no treaties with China. There have been efforts, certainly in context with, say, the P5, to try to set up norms. The U.S. has made a proposal that, for instance, ban on testing kinetic ASAT weapons that would create debris in space. We put that out there. Obviously, China has done that. Russia has done that. It has terrible long-term effects for space satellites. But we've got to be a little more creative in trying to figure out how to at least go the path. But there are none, and that's really the problem.
Does anybody want to say anything about the status of arms control agreements more generally?
Well, let me just mention that, in fact, the New START Treaty, which continues in force and will continue in force until 2026, that treaty does limit the United States and Russia to 1,550 deployed warheads each. But bear in mind, for the moment, this big buildup is coming from China. There's no question about it. But China at this moment has, round about 500 warheads total, compared to 1,550 deployed on the U.S. and Russia side, and a total on each side, U.S. and Russia, each about 4,500 warheads. So China is building up fast, and the threat is before us. So I don't want to shortchange that at all. But for the moment, the agreement between the United States and Russia, the limits of New START, do not prevent us from continuing to deter China at the moment. It's this phased approach that I wanted to stress once again. We are worried not about today necessarily, but we are worried what we see coming in 2030, 2035, and that's what we have to pay attention to. So at the moment, the limits of the New START treaty are there still. Sadly, the Russians ceased implementing the treaty last February, with Putin saying, you stop your assistance to Ukraine and then we'll return to implementing the New START treaty. Well, the administration quite rightly said, you cannot try to leverage us by threatening us about the New START treaty. Both U.S. and Russia are committed to maintaining the limits of New START, but sadly, at the moment, we don't have the implementation measures like on-site verification and exchanges of information, databases, notifications, and so forth. So it's a real problem, but it's a problem of Russia's making. And I do agree that we're in dire straits at the moment with regard to nuclear arms control, but let's see what the future may bring.
And we are getting to the end of our time here. Last question, and I'm going to ask for an answer from each person. What did you learn from being on this commission that surprised you the most?
Oh, that you could. Oh, go ahead.
Let's
I
go
need to
left
think
to
about
right.
that for a minute.
All right,
Okay.
Madeline, go ahead.
That you could actually reach consensus with 12 very disparate, I often refer to us as eclectic views. You know, it was, I really was not convinced we were going to get there.
You know the first paragraph of Tolstoy's novel Anna Karenina, when I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, each family is unhappy in its own way. And we are like one big family, each of us unhappy in his or her own way, but we are a family and we have this consensus to show for it. And to me, that was the biggest surprise, that in this disparate group of 12 very, very different people, we could end up, through months of deep discussions and intense debate, we could end up, at least I feel like, these guys are somewhat my family, so they may not claim me, but nevertheless, that was my biggest
I
surprise.
never had any doubt that we would come together, but I think in retrospect, the thing that really bothers me, and I probably should have realized it, but what sort of surprised me is, you know, in the past, we've relied upon our great capacity as a country to build up our industrial base. To, you know, we were what, the 17th, we had our military before World War II was the 17th largest in the world. And just in a matter of months, really, the United States, with its great industrial might, began to outproduce our enemies in a way that just made it inevitable that we were going to win, both in the European and Pacific theater. And you look at the state of our industrial military base today, and our scientific community, and our workforce skills, and all the rest of it. And China is way better than we are at this. And Russia, with its command economy, can get the job done on its own, too. And we don't yet, we haven't, I guess, I think I would say, despite all the conversations we had with all the experts in government, I am not confident that any of them has an answer to this question that's really going to work. How are we going to get all this stuff done on time? They have a great can-do attitude, which I really love about particularly our military. You give them an order, and by golly, they'll say they're going to do it. But saying they're going to do it and figuring out a way to do it in today's environment is going to be really, really hard. It's going to take the American people somehow giving that support and funding it through the congressional appropriations and seeing the battle as a long-term battle. And there's nothing really more important for the United States government to do than to prevent nuclear war. So, got to do it.
I would like to thank John Kyle, Madeline Creedon, Rose Gottemuller.
Wait a minute, you're ducking the question.
Well,
Yes.
I would subscribe to both of those themes. The collaboration and consensus was very important on the commission. I too was surprised by the way that workforce issues and supply chain issues are affecting our defense effort. Whatever we see in the economy more generally, we see magnified in the very specialized areas in the defense industry. So that is a major problem to try to compete with the exciting civilian technology economy we see so vibrant here in the Bay Area. Our defense efforts, the companies, the national labs, the production facilities are all losing out to the exciting civilian economy in attracting workforce and having the supplies and the commodities and the manufacturing capability to do their job. So So, thank you so much to our panel. Thank you so much to our audience here in San Francisco, to those who are participating online. And I wish us all well in meeting this challenge.
Thank you.